Welcome to Learning with Lee, where we discuss nature and wildlife on Kiawah Island. I'm your host, Lee Bundrick, Land Preservation Coordinator for the Kiawah Conservancy. Today we are going to talk with Lucas Hernandez, the Resilience Specialist for the Kiawah Island Community Association. Lucas is here today to talk to us about the island's unique pond infrastructure and its role in managing stormwater. Hi, Lucas. I'm glad you could be with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I originally grew up in North Carolina in the mountains, and I wanted to be really close to the beach, and the best way to do that was to move down here. Took a while, but I started school at NC State, and at NC State I got a degree in environmental technology and management. After that, I moved down to Charleston, where I found the environmental studies and public administration course at the College of Charleston. And it really appealed to me because it allowed me to both do my research, but then also use that research to help, or really it allowed me to make use of the research in communities and allow people to understand what I had done a lot better than before. But a lot of my research at the college dealt with flooding, and really that's what led me to this position at KICA.
Yeah, I'm familiar with some of the projects you worked on while you're at the college, but for our audience, could you tell us a little bit about what you did before you came to Kiowa?
Right. I worked on a grant with South Carolina Sea Grant, the aquarium, and NOAA, to name a few. There's quite a few more, and Lee knows about this very well because he also was on the Sea Grant side of these grant projects. But we worked with the city of Charleston, the city of North Charleston, Mount Pleasant, and I just missed out working with Folly Beach, but we also worked with the town of Kiawah Island to create similar flood maps that we showed in our recent drainage project. We showed similar ones to the communities that I just listed, and provided an outreach event so folks could come in and see our predictions for flooding. Back then, they were used more as a planning tool, and since I'd gotten here, we've kind of morphed them into being able to look at drainage before and after infrastructure is put in.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about your roles, which you're doing on Kiowa right now. Could you go in a little bit more about what you're doing as a resilience specialist at
Yeah.
KICA?
So my role is to establish, and this is kind of my go-to statement whenever I'm asked this question, because resilience specialist is so new. I think the city was the first one, Mark Wilbert, and he is their resilience officer. But essentially, the title involves creating a compelling resilience vision for our community, and the way that's done is by working across entities and with the local community to maximize the innovation that we use in creating flood mitigation infrastructure and minimizing the impacts of unforeseen events, sort of like the one we had this past week. So, and this relates to major storms, flooding, and then also environmentally and ecological health. So I manage all the flood reports that come in, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that later on, but all the flood reports that are sent to KICA, they come straight to me, and I relay them to our civil engineers or our land crew, or we save them for larger projects like the drainage project we've got going on now. It really just helps us create an understanding of, well, we had this amount of rain, who floods during that time, and what hot spots in the area of the island do we see flooding. I also work with some federal and state departments to collect and share new data as it comes out, and that data comes onto the island, and we use it to create infrastructure. We use it to inform our decision making, and now we've actually moved into creating our own data and the conservancies started a big project of their own. Well, two of them actually, being the groundwater and the marsh vulnerability study. But along with flood reports, I also go to community members' homes and I bring them a piece of that technology by form of a couple of maps, whether it be soils, drainage patterns, elevations in their area, whatever that I think they might be interested in learning about their own property. It helps to create solutions if you know what the problem is and where that water starts moving from in the first place.
Yeah, and I understand you have to work with a lot of people like KICA and on islands. What are some of the projects that you have had to work on since coming in your position?
So when I first finished the grant work I had done for the town, I was actually introduced to KICA about halfway through that. And it was right when the Water Management Task Force had officially formed. And they already had a list of project areas, but they were looking at the maps I had created for the town. And that's where this whole thing sort of morphed into, well, now we know the flooded areas already. And before, that's what the maps were for, just showing where areas flood. But since we already knew what the baseline was, we could change the infrastructure and remove some and add new infrastructure and new outfalls, raise roads. Really, there's unlimited possibilities to how you can manipulate the elevation model to show a change, and that's what we did. So we compared the befores and afters, and then we pressure tested even higher levels of rain, and it worked out really well. Since then, I've helped the town with their study on the resurfacing of the parkway. We looked at projections for sea level rise on into the future and how to mitigate the effects of storms in the future, and we came to the decision that the road does very well in regard to storms. Now, we obviously don't want to prepare for a storm that we may never see. Maybe we've seen it once, but it doesn't make sense to be funding a project that level of surge isn't predicted for another 20 years or the life of the road. So we ended up deciding that the resurfacing alone would have been enough to make that road safe. Since then, I've been sitting on the advisory committee for the Conservancy's groundwater monitoring project and marsh vulnerability projects that they're working on for the town. And I've also helped get the new tide station put in on the Kiowa River Bridge, and I've put in one of my own in collaboration with the South Carolina Beach Advocates in Ocean Park. So now we've got sort of two different gauges on either side of the island to be looking at tidal fluctuation, and those are close to completion. They still need to be leveled and surveyed in, but once that's complete, both data collected from both locations will be available for the public. In the future, I've got a couple projects as well, hoping to get a weather station similar to the caliber of station or tide gauge that was put in by the town, also available for the public to look at. But those monitoring pieces of equipment, they work well to help us understand what a normal tide is for us, and what a normal rainfall amount is, and what combination of those causes problems. And if we can understand what causes the problem, then we can create a better fix.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And how have projects that you've done at the college influenced these projects that you're working on right now?
Well, when I was doing the mapping for the different municipalities, I was able to speak with the emergency managers in those locations and also with the stormwater engineers. So I was able to learn what different communities are doing and then bring that here. So when we were formulating what should we do in each of these project areas of this, using the Water Management Task Force as kind of an example here, we had a lot of different options. And then, obviously the mapping that I had done, it was easy to pull the same techniques and use them here, and actually expand upon them and start being able to test what ifs. So what if we raise a section of this road, or what if we add drainage here? And so the work I had done before, I think it definitely lends itself to what I do now. And I have a feeling that that's just the way the resilience community works. Is some folks have success in one area using a certain type of infrastructure or nature-based solution. Well, that may very well work here too. And really the community around, I guess we'll call it flood science, is very readily sharing success stories and ideas, and it's an exciting sphere to work in. So I don't foresee anything being done here that hasn't been done somewhere else before. Maybe that's not the best way to put it, but we're always pulling in ideas to use here. And that's sort of part of my role as resilience specialist.
Yeah, and you mentioned that KICA is working on their plans for for major infrastructure improvements on the island to improve drainage, and a lot of that came through the Water Management Task Force, and they actually pushed out some plans recently and released them to the community. Could you tell us a little bit more about those projects?
Yeah, so there's 6 major projects, and they were developed in areas where we knew there were issues to begin with. And what we wanted out of these first set of projects was we wanted clear egress and ingress from the island during a heavy rainfall, enough to where normally the system would fail. And, that could be a 10-year storm. Right now, we're seeing it happen at just a 2-year storm, which is, all of that terminology relates to is 1 year you're guaranteed 100% chance you'll have that amount of rainfall in a 24-hour period. We chose to use that as our map to provide to residents because it's the most relatable. And even at that lowest level, 3.8 inches in 24 hours, we had roads that were impassable on the island. We could have went up to 10-year, but the story is the same, and the end result is the same. We've created solutions that we've pressure tested up through the 10-year rainfall amount, and we've seen no change. All the roads are still passable. And in fact, we used the same parameters for the 2015 storm. I'm sure a lot of viewers remember that storm. There's all sorts of numbers for the amounts of rainfall that happened in that period, but to the best have, and it also depends where you use rainfall values at, but the storm surge from it was about 2.5 foot above mean high or high water, which would have been, reading a NOAA station, it would have been a 9.5 foot tide or 8.5 foot tide. And then there was, I want to say, about 11 or 12 inches of rain on top of that. So we ran that in the before, and we validated it with reports that we had and with personal accounts from residents that sat on the task force. And we added the new infrastructure again and ran the same parameters, and all the roads did have water on them, but they were passable. All of the major routes off the island and on the island.
Yes. And you mentioned the task force, and there was residents, and I think KICA staff working on this. Who was involved with the task force on these projects?
The chair was Mr. Dave Morley. The task force was sort of a subset of the finance committee. Jimmy Bailey also sat on it. Shannon White. We had Mr. Govindan sat on it, and we had several residents, and forgive me, I can't remember their names, but they are all listed on our website. So if anyone's curious, it's all in the vote website.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll make sure to include that as a link for our viewers so they can look at that. And another thing is where should residents go if they have questions about these projects?
You can actually email either flood@kica.us. Any of those questions we hope are geared more towards the drainage project itself. And then if you have questions about voting, or if you haven't, or voting number, then you can contact vote@kica.us. And really, if you use either one of those, it'll get directed to the right person. We've got staff members on either email answering those questions as they come in every day. That vote will be done by the end of this month. So if any of you haven't voted that are viewing, please go ahead and do so. Every vote counts.
And it sounds like what these projects are focused on, specifically with this new plan, is that KICA looking to address high priority projects at the moment. And I guess another question is what is KICA looking to do in the future to address drainage on the island?
I think a lot of that has to do with the flood reporting. So whenever we have a major event, security does a great job of going around, looking at roads, finding ones that are flooded, and then going out and putting cones or redirecting traffic. And they make up a good portion of the reports that come in. But reports from residents are all collected as well. So they're all put into one database. And what that allows us to do is when we decide, okay, again, it's time for solutions to be looked at, and maybe this next time it'll be for minor roads. And we're able to look at those reports and the concentrations of how many points are in one location and determine, well, maybe that area needs to be addressed first. And we've got real data to back up and real accounts from residents to back up why we chose to make that decision. So in the future, certainly these projects aren't going to make the island flood free. They serve to make our major roadways passable during an extreme event so that people can get off the island in time or emergency services can get on. I think that we will be continually working to solve issues as we find them. And the flood reports are our extension of learning where those issues lie and how to prioritize what projects come next.
Yeah, and it sounds like you work pretty closely with residents, and a lot of KICA does that as well. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about how you help residents in your position?
Right. So when a flood report comes in, I'll just talk about what usually goes on. So the flood report will come in, and there's a whole form that will be filled out. So I'll know if it is a tidally influenced drainage problem. Is it rainfall? Is it a combination of the two? Or is it just a failure of the drainage infrastructure? Maybe it's clogged or something like that. I'll also get a description of where the flooding is at and how long it was there. And then, of course, it'll have the contact information from the individual who submitted the report, which will include an email or a phone number. And I'll either email those folks or I'll call them and we'll set up a time to meet. During that meeting, a lot of the times I'll provide them with some data. So actually, here's one for today. And this is elevations. So a lot of what I gear the meetings towards is elevations because that's the driver for the movement of water on our island. We've got anywhere from 0 to 8 or 9 feet of elevation. So that is the island's variation in topography. And wherever the house may be, I can look and is the area surrounding it built up? Does it sit in a low-lying area? A lot of the times I can go to these folks' homes and predict where their flooding is going to be just by looking at these maps. So it's even a more powerful tool in their hands. They know when it floods. They know by looking outside and the amount of rain coming down, how much water they're going to have in that one spot in their yard that they know floods. Well, what I can do is I can tell them where that water is coming from. Built into this, I don't know if you were able to see it when I held it up. There's actually flow lines, so we can sort of predict just with elevations, and the data that's out there now is in a 2.5 foot resolution. So each pixel is 2.5 by 2.5 feet, and it has a specific elevation, and all those are merged together. That's why the lines were smooth in there. We can use that information and set maybe 1 acre drainage areas, and we can look and see where those lines combine will have pooling of water. That's your flooding. So a lot of the times that is in low-lying areas. And so what I try to do is just help the homeowner understand more about what's causing the problem, and from there we kind of discuss solutions to it. We've got several residents right now who we've had these visits and we've had talks, and they go the extra mile and go ahead and get a survey of their property, and then we're able to help them make decisions, and our engineers are available to help any property owner that decides they want to build into our drainage network, or to kind of fix their problem on their own. We're happy to help point people to the right folks to contract with and approve designs if they desire.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's some actions that residents could potentially do to, once they get the information, they can push in and they can mitigate the impacts. What are some actions you think that residents can do to help reduce these flooding impacts?
So, that's something we talk about a lot too, is the cost for these fixes. A lot of the times, the initial thought is, wow, I have to do some major land moving, or I need a major engineering design to fix this solution. And sometimes it doesn't need to be that serious. There's things that you can do on your own property, like putting in more pervious concrete. I've actually got a phone call later this week to discuss a resident that was successful getting that put in with approval from all the correct entities, and it looks very nice. So there's, the more plantings that you have around your property, the more water will be absorbed, and the better the soil is held in place. There's the ability to put in rain gardens, and what you'll do with those is you intercept runoff, not from the point that's flooding, but the point where water is running into that area. You can intercept it and allow that water to infiltrate. But there's really 3 main solutions to flooding, and that's diversion, it's infiltration, and then it's collection. So you can use a combination of the 3 or one of the 3, and you can move water. It's just a matter of doing it to where you're not harming someone else's property by making a fix on your own. That's why I usually go for the collection and infiltration routes, allowing the water to seep down into the soil on your own property rather than moving it over land. That's where issues normally happen. So, those are just a couple, and if anyone reaches out to me, we can discuss more at length, but those are sort of the more popular ones at the moment.
Well, Lucas, thank you for telling us a little bit about flooding and your position and everything you're doing there. And I want to thank you for joining us and answering some of these questions for us.
Absolutely.
Join me next time for Learning with Lee.